Kansas State thought they had all the answers this offseason, but we are once again in the exact same spot. Where do you move on? Where do you figure this out? Where do we go from here?
You are Locked On Kansas State, your daily podcast on the Kansas State Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on into Locked On Kansas State, your daily Kansas State Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Christian Rauh, and thank you so much for making Locked On Kansas State your first listen every single day. Welcome back to my everydayers. Happy Friday to everyone. We're going to dig into some college basketball talk here. Might not be the best feeling in the world when we're done with this conversation, but we're going to talk some facts, we're going to talk some trueness, and we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty with a really sensitive conversation about Kansas State men's basketball. Before we do that, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, the biggest things I want to get into today, by no surprise, is what's going on with this men's basketball team. A 4-game losing streak after being so close to making it to the NCAA tournament. They were a bubble team after a great 6-game winning streak, including ranked wins against Iowa State and Kansas, and it falls apart. And it falls apart on a West Coast trip to a BYU team that is now ranked, and that team is going to be great, and I think could cause some damage in the tournament, not going to lie. Utah, who just a few games later fired their head coach. They're in just as big of a mess as Kansas State is. And then, of course, this past week with Arizona State, and then UCF just the other night. UCF, their coach is battling for their job, as we mentioned in the crossover with Mike Giddens just a few days ago on the channel. It's a tough situation for Kansas State to be in. There has already been some coaching carousels, some movement in the Big 12. Is there a possibility? Is there a chance that we might see something like that with Kansas State? And should we have the conversation for that type of really thought process? Now, I want to get into this because although there are many people upset about how Kansas State is performing this season, I don't think we're going to see much change in the coaching staff. Now, that has a lot to do with Jerome Tang and his contract, the one that was just signed as an extension just this last season after he decided not to leave for Arkansas. He stayed, and Kansas State's president and athletic director Richard Linton and Gene Taylor decided to sign him to an agreement that would extend his contract out to 2031. There was a nice pay raise with that, and also their buyout. The buyout comes into that. Actually, the buyout with the extension actually lowered a little bit, but it's still a pretty decent buyout. So before we get into the conversation about Jerome Tang and your thought process about him, what needs to change, because I do think there is a lot of things that need to change heading into this offseason and these losing streaks and what we saw at the beginning of the season with the non-conference schedule, and really just take away those 6 games of what felt like being on cloud 9 for just a little bit, right? We got to forget about the worries of Kansas State basketball for those 6 games when it felt like the team that we all expect them to be. Let's move those to the side for now, because the majority of the season has felt like what we're feeling right now. So let's talk about this Jerome Tang contract. If you're not aware, if you don't know much about the contract of Jerome Tang or his extension, you've maybe seen on social media of a couple people calling for his firing. I will not do that on this show, by the way. I will be very critical of certain players and coaches. I'm not afraid of doing that. I will not apologize by any means, but I will not in this right now say that there is a time to fire Jerome Tang. I don't think we're at that point yet. And just stick with me, because I do think some changes need to happen regardless of what I just said. But talking about his contract, the new deal boosted Tang's salary up by $500,000 per year. And just this season alone, he's making $3.5 million during the 24-25 season. That number is actually going to increase $100,000 annually until it maxes out to $4.1 million in his final year, the 2030 to 31 year. Now, that's if he stays this entire time. There, like we mentioned, there's already been some suitors that have gone after him Arkansas was one just a few seasons ago. He stuck around. That's one of the reasons for the contract extension. But the biggest thing here is the buyout. And his buyout numbers did decrease when he did sign the extension from $6 million to $5 million. Now, that might sound like a lot, but that number of $5 million changes after this season. On April 30th, 2025, that number goes from $5 million and decreases another $1 million annually until it bottoms out at $1 million towards the end of his contract. So if there is some types of decisions that may be going down the road, those decisions do get easier as the game or as the seasons move along for Jerome Tang and his contract. So after this year, if you wanted to get rid of him, if you were the front office of Kansas State, if you were the athletic director or the president, whatever the case may be, and you decided that you wanted to make some changes in the head coaching position, I guarantee you it would happen in May. It would happen after April 30th because it would go from $5 million to $4 million. That conversation that we say, hey, do you have any $5 million laying around? The social media, Kansas State trolls in this case like to have that conversation and laugh about it. I don't really think it's a laughing matter because at this point, we have Jerome Tang. And we have to remember that in year one, he took this team to the Elite Eight. That seems to be forgotten because the last two seasons, he's missed the NCAA tournament, with this year being another year in year three of his tenure at Kansas State. But he did some great things in the first year. He deserved that contract extension. There was a reason why a SEC team in Arkansas was chasing Jerome Tang. And I don't think that Arkansas will be the last team to go after Jerome Tang before this contract is expired. Take that as you will. So after this season, that buyout will be $4 million. If you think that's enough, or you think that's well enough or good enough for you to make a decision to move on from Jerome Tang, I'll leave that one up to you. Now, we put that one aside. Let's move on to a different subject real quick. One of the biggest things that we've talked about this entire season was transfers coming in. This is going to be a great team. How deep this team's going to be. This team has Sweet 16, Elite 8 potential because of the transfers coming in, mainly Coleman Hawkins. Now, I don't think you can put a lot of blame on Coleman Hawkins. I personally think he's the farthest from who to blame when it comes to most of the conversations in this one, because we've seen it in the last couple of games. When he hasn't played, this team looks dreadful. Like no one's driving the bus. Like there is nobody there. Not a single person. It's terrible. The last two games have been the worst two games that I have watched all season, non-conference included. So I find it hard to put blame on Coleman Hawkins in this one. Now, Jerome Tang did come out with a comment right after the post game, and it was a very interesting one as well, because normally he takes full responsibility for the games. He did that against Arizona State, the loss. He said he needs to coach better, but his tone changed a little bit. And his tone said, and I'm going to give you the quote here, it said, quote, "I normally take the blame for stuff in everything, but at some point, some of these guys have got to take ownership of what's going on out there. This one is very frustrating," talking about the loss after UCF in Orlando. Another road loss for Kansas State. They only have 2 road wins this entire season, one against Iowa State in Ames, which is wild to think about, that was the game that broke the road streak, by the way. Probably the toughest place they've played at on the road all season long, and they get that win. And then a win at Arizona State, which was only by 1 point, by the way. And they couldn't finish off the Sun Devils in Manhattan with a team of Arizona State that was missing players. BJ Freeman was removed from the roster that day. They announced it that day. Arizona State still came in and took care of Kansas State quite easily. It was quite embarrassing, actually. But Jerome Tang changes his ways. He changes his viewpoint here. And is that a sign for what's more to come? It could be. It very well could be. I want to get more talking about the Coleman Hawkins situation, more about Jerome Tang, and so much more. And then we have to discuss the elephant in the room, right? Buddy Rich played in the UCF game. What? What's going on with that? I know many people are excited to discuss that. Let's do that next, right here on Locked On Kansas State.
Life moves at you fast. When you have a family, one day you're watching your kids take their first step, and before you know it, they're off to college. That's why securing their future is so important. Fabric by Gerber Life makes it simple to get term life insurance that fits your family needs. With Fabric, you can apply for term life insurance online, right from your couch. You could be covered in under 10 minutes, and in many cases, no health exam is required. You can get $1 million in coverage for less than $1 a day. So protecting your loved ones doesn't have to break the bank. They also offer free digital wills, access to investment accounts to help you plan for your children's future. So join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to protect their family. Apply today in just minutes at meetfabric.com/lockedoncollege. That's meetfabric.com/lockedoncollege. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Insurance Company, not available in certain states. Price is subject to underwriting and health questions.
And welcome on back. And thank you so much for making Locked On Kansas State your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On College Basketball with Isaac Shade and Andy Patton. Don't wait until March. Be the most informed college basketball fan now. Find Locked On College Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So check that out for your second listen of the day. We're talking maybe not the most optimistic views on this podcast today, discussing the men's basketball team of Kansas State after losing to UCF just the other day. If you noticed, I didn't have a live post-game show for that one. My good old buddy Jeff Burkhart was feeling down. We'll be back on Sunday, hopefully, for a conversation with Colorado, and maybe we'll have some more optimistic views on that one. I'm finding that one hard to believe, though, after them losing 4 games in a row to some of the lowest teams in the Big 12. After what appeared that this team could be a top seed, maybe we're talking at one point of them receiving some buys in the Big 12 tournament heading into Kansas City. Now we're lucky if this team's going to get a win in the Big 12 tournament after what they've played right now. Would you be shocked if they'd lost every single game the rest of the way? After what I've seen the last couple games, I don't think I would be that shocked. And you might have noticed that my tone of this team has changed a little bit, but I think if you've watched the last couple games, you might be feeling the same way as me as well. I talked about Coach Tang and his buyout portion, and maybe take it as you will or how you feel about that portion, but I want to just give you the knowledge of where his contract sits and why it is very unlikely that there will be a coaching change, at least at that level, in the near future. Now, I do think that some coaching changes need to happen when it comes to Kansas State's men's basketball team. It won't be Jerome Tang, but I think some of the lower staff, or just, and what I mean by lower staff, just below him, need the change. Get a different type of faces in there, just maybe some different minds that can help change the culture. I mean, we talked about the buy-in for so long with Kansas State this season, and it took forever to get that buy-in, to get that 6-game winning streak that happened in the middle of the season, something we were hoping for early at the beginning of the year in this non-conference schedule that really wasn't that hard of a non-conference schedule. If you look back at the net rankings at some of the games that they lost against, they're not great. Kansas State doesn't have a great net ranking. For the record, the Big 12, every single team in the Big 12 is in at least the top 100 in the net rankings. Kansas State's one of those bottom teams, unfortunately, but some of those teams they lost to are even below them right now. Kansas State didn't have a good non-conference record. They didn't have a good non-conference beginning of the season, and they're also not doing very well this time around. Arizona State, they snapped a 6-game losing streak with the win against Kansas State just last week. UCF, like we mentioned, their coach is fighting for their job. It's a tough situation to be in with Kansas State. Now, one thing to talk about with this buyout real quick, and there's one more thing I should bring up, and I didn't bring it into. These numbers actually shift a little bit more, and I don't think this is going to be happening. But again, for the knowledge standpoint, if you want to know more about this, instead of searching around, trying to figure out what's going on with this contract, if the athletic director, if Gene Taylor was actually to be removed or move on or is no longer employed by Kansas State, however that may happen, him retiring, moving on, whatever the case may be, that buyout figure actually reduces by 50% for 12 months following any type of departure of Gene Taylor. So let's just put this in perspective, just an example. Let's say after April, heading into May of 2025, when that is $4 million buyout now, let's just say May 1st, Taylor decides to retire from Kansas State. That buyout changes to $2 million. So if you're one of those people who are pro moving on to a new coach of Kansas State, that's something that maybe you can put in your back pocket for a conversation at your next bar conversation on Friday night. But to me, I don't think that's a scenario we're going to see in the near future. What he's done with the football team, we're about to play in Dublin. There's a lot of things I don't, unless he chooses to retire, I don't see us moving on from the athletic director. But again, for the knowledge standpoint. And I want to wrap up one more thing about Coleman Hawkins. We talk about all this money. Him bringing in, there was the reported figure of Coleman Hawkins was $2.1 million of him playing for one season in Manhattan. Now, obviously, he didn't live up to that expectation this year, whether he plays another game or not, because of his injury to his knee bruise. But they had to do this because this goes back a lot farther than just this season with the transfer portal. And if you've been a Kansas State fan for quite some time, you're going to understand this conversation a little bit more than maybe some others, and that's fine. But let me explain it to you. And this might make more sense to why after the non-conference schedule, right before the new year struck, Coach Tang was pretty furious, and you could tell that he was not liking this narrative, and for good reason. And honestly, I don't blame the criticism on either side, to be completely honest, about why the people were using the NIL as a reason to be upset about the team not succeeding. The unfair criticism, if you will. With him getting all of this money, with Coleman Hawkins getting this money, there's other transfers that came in as well, them not succeeding. Of course, that's something that you need to pay attention to, for sure. You had to find a way to spend money on NIL with all the transfers leaving, finding a way to be successful. I completely understand that. In this new world of NIL and transfer, it's an adapt or die situation. And we found that out early in the process, very early. Nigel Pack, just a few years ago, left for Miami in what seemed to be a very high-profile leave. I mean, it was on national level of him going to Miami. They talked about the numbers, and at that time, I believe it was around $750,000, $850,000 or $800,000 what he received. At that point, that was a lot of money. We weren't at the $1 million in NIL for men's basketball players yet, and that money was huge. And that helped Pack bring Miami to a Final Four. So knowing that you had great players leaving Kansas State to go somewhere else to help them succeed, the blueprint to bring them in here made a lot of sense to why you'd think they would succeed. And I don't think that just because it didn't work this time doesn't mean it's not going to work again. I think you have to go back to the well this offseason. And by the looks of what the recruiting has looked like so far for Kansas State and men's basketball, not much has happened so far. Hopefully that changes once the season's over and they get a little hot this summer. Regardless of it, I think they're going to go back to the transfer portal. And they're going to do the same thing. Now, they might change the way that they attack it, depending on what players stay. If Brennan Hawson sticks around, if Doug McDaniel sticks around, they probably don't have to dip in as deep, meaning you already have some sort of culture or buy-in. And if you bring in some different staff people that can help change that scheme, help change that culture, that buy-in, whatever buzzword you want to use today, you might only need to bring one more impact player and a couple other players that could come off the bench. It's possible. It's possible, but I think things have to change. There's a lot of things to talk about here on this show. And last thing, let's before we go to the next segment, let's at least talk about something good, right? 4 games losing streak, losing a 4-point matchup to UCF 80-76. You know, if you watch the game towards the end of the game, whatever you want to say about these Big 12 refs, I think everybody said it so far. I don't know what else to say about them. That's probably as far as I'm going on today's episode about it. But on a bright note, Buddy Rich got into the game and played 14 minutes, got 4 points, 2 for 3 from the field, found himself at 4 rebounds. He fouled a lot, and he got 3 fouls pretty quick, but right off the bat, him dunking, getting a nice rebound. It was over a player, but I mean, he got a nice dunk. It's nice to see him back in the lineup. And I know that we've had comments either on live post games or just in comments on YouTube, which I appreciate and thank you so much. I try to get back to every comment that I possibly can. What was happening with him? And I hope I'm wrong. And I went out on our Twitter X page at Locked On K-State, and I said, I hope I'm wrong about thinking that Buddy Rich is going to be leaving for the transfer portal on day one of this offseason when the window opens. Because I didn't expect to see him play ever again in a Kansas State Wildcats uniform. We have no idea why he didn't play for that long of a time. And then he finally gets the opportunity in UCF. I don't know if this is a way for Tang to wave the white flag. I'm not sure. I mean, regardless, there's no tourney hopes unless you win the whole thing in Kansas City, which let's be clear, it's bleak. You can't have a winning record in conference now. The best you can go is 10-10, which again, very bleak. But the fact you finally get McCaleb Buddy Rich into a game, to me, it's one game too late. If you were going to do it, he would have fit perfectly in the Arizona State game, but she finally got him in there. I hope this changes the aspect of what they think about him or gives him more of an opportunity to play more minutes. I'd love to see him and David Castillo get as many minutes as possible the rest of the season, because if you plan on keeping Buddy Rich, if he wants to stay in this type of program, whatever the off court or whatever the behind the scenes situation, I guess, is over with, or at least it's enough for him to get back on the court. Who knows if we'll ever find out what that is. Maybe he'll wait till after the season and we'll actually find out. Maybe he'll wait till he transfers out of here. Hopefully not the case, but until we figure out what actually happened. Regardless of the case, I'd like to see David Castillo and Buddy Rich get more minutes for the rest of the season. Because really, the next 3 games, do they matter? Not in the aspect of moving forward for an at-large bid. That is gone. That is out the window. So unless you're trying to move up maybe 1 seed in the Big 12 tournament, change your ways. I mean, experiment a little bit here. You got 3 games before you go to Kansas City to find a way to most likely find a way to play better without Coleman Hawkins, because we don't know if he's going to be back. And when he does, we don't know if he's going to be 100%, right? We're not really sure. After the Arizona State game, Coach Tang said in the press conference he was not close to playing that Sunday. He obviously didn't play this past game against UCF. And then when he asked if they needed more time to recover, he said most likely. Of course, that happened against the Knights. He didn't play. But the quote he said was this: "When the doctor tells me he's healthy, I will know. Until then, I'm pursuing every day like we don't have him." To me, that tells me that he's probably not coming back until he's ready to go. This is a player that took a bag to come to Manhattan to not only help Kansas State get to a new level, which unfortunately didn't happen, but there are still some personal aspirations there. And that's for him to find a way to get into the NBA. And if this season is a lost cause, then he might not be returning. And this isn't me throwing anything at Coleman Hawkins' character, but we've seen it from plenty of other players in multiple sports. In football and basketball, we see so many players who enter the NFL draft opt out of bowl games. What would you expect a guy like Coleman Hawkins, who's trying to find himself in the NBA draft with right now an injury that could impact him moving forward for his dream, for his next goal in life? So I'm not sure if we're going to see him back this season, at least maybe in the regular season. Maybe he comes back in the Big 12 tournament for them to just try and have a run. But regardless of the case, you need to find a way to get this team to a spot to where they can perform without Coleman Hawkins. It was the same with the women's squad. When Ayoka Lee went down, they had to find a way to play basketball, great basketball, without Ayoka Lee. And they did that for quite some time. They beat TCU. They did a really good job. Now, things are starting to change a little bit with the women's side. We'll talk about that later on this week as they get ready for the Big 12 tourney and the NCAA tourney. We'll have you all covered here on Locked On Kansas State. But there is plenty of chances for them to experiment, and I hope that means Buddy Rich and David Castillo are front and center. But speaking of other players, there are some all Big 12 possibilities, even though they're not having a great season. Something that didn't happen last year. Although they're doing the same exact thing record-wise, not making the tournament, there could be some plus sides for some personal accolades. We'll talk about that to finish up this show right here on Locked On Kansas State.
March basketball is here, and there's no better way to get in action than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, you pick more or less on at least 2 players' projections, and if you're right, you can win money, baby. You can win 1,000 times your cash. It's fast, it's easy, and it keeps every game exciting. I love how you can make my picks in less than 60 seconds and stay engaged all game long. And on Tuesdays, they got promos. Talk about Taco Tuesday. Yeah, they got promos like that where you get discounted player projections for even more value. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege, all one word, for $50 off instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's Locked On College, all one word, for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game.
And let's put a bow on this one here on Locked On Kansas State. Do me a favor, hit that subscribe button below to make sure that you are getting every single Locked On Kansas State episode directly to your feed. You can even hit that bell. It'll send you a notification when I'm putting out new episodes. March is going to be a huge month. It's going to be a huge one, folks. It's going to be great. We're going to talk a lot of college football, a lot of college basketball on both sides, and eventually we're going to get to the baseball play as well. I'm waiting for them to be over with the Flow Sports and the D1. I refuse to buy more subscriptions. There's just so many subscriptions these days. I'm waiting for them to get back to it. They got a huge game against LSU this weekend. Hopefully they can get another ranked win, and then we can start talking some baseball on this page as well. But with that being said, let's wrap up this conversation with the men's basketball team. They do play Colorado this week on Sunday. Colorado hasn't been a great team this year. They started off good in the non-conference. There was a team that many people thought that they could be pretty decent. They were in a tournament with Iowa State and UConn and I believe Auburn at the beginning of the season. And they found a way to get some wins in that one. Let me pull up their schedule right now. I'm pretty sure they got a couple wins. They beat UConn. I know that. 73-72 in that matchup. They wound up, it was Michigan State in UConn and Iowa State. Maybe it wasn't Auburn in that one. But they found a way to get that win against, at the time, the second-ranked team in the nation, UConn. Now, we all know that UConn's not the same team as they were the last couple seasons, but they are back-to-back national champions. And Colorado found a way to do that. But then things changed for them. They didn't get a conference win in the Big 12 until they beat UCF, the team that Kansas State just lost to, on February 15th. They went and had a pretty rough stretch, but they've had 2 wins since then, against UCF, which Kansas State lost to, and against Baylor, which Kansas State lost to. Now they head in and take on Kansas State in Manhattan on Sunday. That tip-off's going to be at 3 o'clock Central on ESPN+. And we'll see what happens from that one moving forward. I'm not going to give a score prediction because I don't really think it matters. But what I want to see is I want to see some new things. I want to see some sort of experiments. Find a way to get Buddy Rich involved now that he's back on the table. Find a way to get David Castillo to be more of a facilitator. This is a guy who is a true freshman, the only true freshman in your program. Utilize these next 3 games to make him no longer feel like a freshman. Help him make that next step to become a leader for next season. This is a prime opportunity to do that right now. And if that happens, then this season isn't as lost as we all hope, or we all think it is. There's no hope. So let's hope that happens with David Castillo and Buddy Rich. I'd like to see David Kassan also make a next step forward. I mean, we saw both Max Jones and CJ Jones play great against UCF, especially Max Jones. He was great. But what I want to see is David Kassan do good as well, because he deserves everything here. I mean, I think out of all the players, I feel the most bad from David Kassan about this season not turning out the way it is. But we might at least see some personal accolades going his way. And maybe Coleman Hawkins as well. Last season, the all 12 men's basketball awards, when you looked at Big 12 first team, second team, third team, when you looked at even all defensive team, newcomer team, and even freshman team, not a single Kansas State player was there. The only time that Kansas State was mentioned last season in these awards was all Big 12 honorable mention, and that went to Tyler Perry and Arthur Kluma. That's it. Other than that, Kansas State was nowhere to be found on the awards last season. Now, we all know what happened last season. They went to the NIT. That didn't even work out that great as well. But there's a really strong possibility that we could see Coleman Hawkins and David Gasson name pop up in these awards at the end of the season, potentially more than once. I could see for both Coleman Hawkins and David Gasson, them battling to be on the Big 12 all-defensive team. I could see that, and it would make a lot of sense. Coleman Hawkins also probably will find himself on the Big 12 all-newcomer team. I think that would make a lot of sense as well. I don't think we're going to get the freshman. I don't think David Castillo had enough time to play. There's a lot of really good freshmen in this conference. But then I also think we might see David Gasson find himself on the all Big 12, probably second team. I think he's one off from being on the first team with some of the forwards that are playing very well in this conference. Again, this is one of the toughest conferences in college basketball. And Gasson, what he did for last month, winning Big 12 Player of the Month, I think he'll find himself on the all Big 12 second team. And comparing that to last year, where Kansas State was, quite frankly, nowhere to be found, if you want to just forget about the honorable mentions, forget about in this case, that's very close to being a participation trophy when you read the report, because it's a list. You don't get to see the nice breakdown with the positions, your height, your weight, where your hometown is. You don't get that type of accolade when you win honorable mention. They put your name in alphabetical order and say, good job, buddy. But I think there's an opportunity for David Gasson and Coleman Hawkins to find themselves on some of these all Big 12 teams when the season's over. Take that as a bright spot. Take Buddy Rich being back in the lineup as a bright spot. I mean, right now, take anything you can. Let's hope there's some nice experiments coming on Sunday. Again, we should be there for a live post game, myself and Jeff Burkhart. You can always find that here on the channel. But until then, please subscribe. We're going to be back with another episode later on today, talking some football as we finish out the month of February and get you into the weekend. Until then, please like the video, please subscribe, and this has been Locked On Kansas State.